In this episode, I'm going to use QGIS to generate 3D geometry and then Blender to render the image so that layouts like this can be created. In a previous video, I have shown how you can use terrain data and elevation data to create topographic 3D maps with QGIS and Blender. In this episode, it will be more discrete data, and I will not be as thorough as in the last video with the Blender part. So if you want a more detailed description of how you work with Blender, you should start with the other video, and I will leave a link in the description to that. But I will start with QGIS. I will be using the latest version as of right now, and it doesn't really matter what type of discrete data you are using. I will be using population data over Sweden, and it is 1 kilometer square polygons that has an attribute called pop that has a number which describes how many people lives in that square. So if I turn that off, layer styling, make this graduated based on pop, turn the outline off, select another color ramp, create a new color ramp, CPT City, and let's see, I think this one could work. And equal count will probably not be the best choice in this case, since some values are really big and most values are really small. So I think I will go with pretty breaks. That is probably more representative. This data is far too much to work with reasonable speed. So I have made a selection where I used the select features by radius tools and exported it to another sub data set that is more reasonable to work with. So I'll just copy the styling to this one. That, we can turn that off. And in 3D, 3D has come a long way in QGIS. For many production cases, it's still not quite there, but you'll see what I mean when I show you this in 3D. So let's make a new 3D view. I'll dock it here, make it a bit bigger. So this is just the 2D view, not 3D. So for 3D, I want to use a single symbol. It should be extruded by the pop attribute. So I just select that field here in the data defined overrides. And it shows up in 3D, but it's really not that pretty. If I want the same color scheme, I can apply that as well by using the diffuse color and data defined overrides and using the assistant. So here I can select the pop as well and update the values. select the same color ramp. It was this one. And I think I will apply some transform curve. Maybe like that. So you will get a result in QGIS, but it's, well, it leaves something to be desired. But it works, and some data works perfectly well, but in some cases it's a bit chunky, if that is a word. But anyway, I don't need any of this, I only need the 3D data. And you can export it from QGIS with this button, Export 3D Scene. And yep, no, I will save it in the same location as the data, and that was Pop Stockholm. Terrain resolution, yeah, let's go for the default. Model scale. When you export the OBJ from QGIS, it will be really small when you import it into Blender. So you might want to set a model scale other than 1. In this case, I'm using 100, but your mileage may vary depending on your data. But in this case, I will set a larger scale for this. Textures will not matter because QGIS don't export any colors in the file. The MTL file is completely empty when you export it. I don't know if that's a bug or what it is, but when I export it, no textures are included. So we will work with untextured data in Blender. So anyway, export it. Then we can switch to Blender. And I will be using Blender 3.4. I don't think that matters that much. It will probably work just fine in older versions. And the default scene with a camera, light source, and a cube is a good starting point, but I will not use the cube, so I will delete that. Let me just turn on screen capture for the keyboard keys and mouse. So down here you will see if I press the left, right, middle mouse button and if I press any keys on the keyboard. First of all, we need to import file, import wavefront OBJ. And let's go to the location where it's stored. So here you have the OBJ file, and you see here the MTL file, the textures, it's completely empty. So there's nothing in it. But I open the OBJ, and there we have that. It will be imported with not really in the center of the scene, because the geometric center of the model is not at the 0 level. So we can move this up a bit by pressing G for grab, and then Z to lock in the Z axis, and then just move it up until it's slightly above center. I will change that later. And as you see here, there's a lot of different parts to this OBJ file. so there are many objects. And I only want to work with one object, so I will merge these. So I will go to a side view like this. I can press 1 on the numeric keyboard and make a rectangle and just barely touch the bottom part. And the important thing is that one of the parts is selected before that. So just select one and then select them all, so that one has a different color. Because when I join these objects, they need to be joined to something. Now I see I have also selected the light, and that should not be selected. So pressing Shift and clicking on it until it's unselected. One more, like that. And now I have no extra selected here, so I press Shift and click this one. So I only have, is my camera selected? Nope. So I only have the objects that I imported selected, and one of them has this different color. So now I can join these objects by pressing Ctrl J. And now they are only one object here. There's a problem, however, but I'll get back to that. First, I want to add a plane underneath all these. And to add an object, I press Shift A, select Mesh and Plane. It's quite a small plane, so I will scale that up. So press S for scale, and I want to scale it 100 times. So I just press 100, Enter. And then we see that it is above. And that's fine for now. We are right now in something called solid mode. And that this menu, you get to that by pressing Z on the keyboard and holding it. So press Z, and then you can move to wireframe, rendered, solid, or material preview, and let go of Z, and that will lock the presentation mode you have selected. The equivalent buttons are up here. So wireframe, solid, textured preview, and rendered view. But I will use Z, go to rendered view, and selecting that. Here we see that the light source has some issues. I will select the light source, and to the right there's light data or light properties, object data properties. Select that and change from point source to sun. And now it's far too bright, so the strength change 1000 to maybe 15. It's probably more useful. I will also move it up by pressing G to grab, and I could lock it on the Z-axis, and right there. And this yellow handle is where the sun is pointing. So I want it to point towards the right from this perspective. So let's do it like this. So my shadows goes to the right. And we can play with that later. Right now, we are using the render engine Eevee. And that is a real-time renderer, so it's really quick. And if you have a slow computer, this may actually be your only choice. Because the other choice is you should have a more potent computer, and preferably a computer with a dedicated graphics card. However, I will switch to that render engine now, and if your computer is too slow for that, you can still work in Eevee and then switch to the other render engine when you are ready to do your final rendering. But I will switch to Eevee or to Cycles. And depending on your setup, you can use GPU compute, which will be, in most cases, faster. And to enable GPU compute, you go to Edit, Preferences, and under System, you can select CUDA, Optics, HIP, One API, or whatever. And I have an NVIDIA graphics card that supports optics, and I find that really fast. So I will use optics for this. I will also enable denoising, and I will switch to optics. And for rendering, I will also use optics. And I don't need 1,000 samples, so I will go down to 164, I think is enough to preview. And for rendering, I will use, let's start with 128. And that's it. Let's see how that looks. As you see right now, there is something weird. There's a pattern in this. I'm not sure if you see it, but if I switch to CPU, it should be visible. This pattern here. That is because the overlapping objects, they are overlapping. And I need to merge those polygons that are in the on the overlapping parts. So I will select the object, and then I will go into edit mode up here. I can also press tab on the keyboard. Then I want to select all the objects by pressing A on the keyboard. And I can right click and then go to merge vertices by distance. And then I can go back to object mode by pressing tab or up here. And now it should be fixed. So if I switch back to GPU compute, there are no more lines in my model. Let me zoom in a bit and close the gap between the base plane and the model. So I select the model or the base plane and press G to grab and Z to lock in the Z direction and move the mouse up. And if it's too fast, I can press a shift on the keyboard and it will be finer or more sensitive or less sensitive. So about there, I think. Okay, now we have a reasonable light to start all this with, and that should be good to work with. And if you are using Eevee, it will not look like this. Eevee looks like this, so bear that in mind. Many of the settings will only be visible in cycles. Select the object or the model. Go to these material properties. And as you see here, there are no materials, so we need to create a new material. And I will name that population. And select a base color. And you can use any color you want. Be creative. I will select a bit discreet. No. A bit discreet, yellowish, brownish. Maybe a bit darker. Something like that. And there are a lot of settings in this basic surface settings. So apart from color, you can play with, for instance, metallic. So if you bring that up to 1, fully metallic, and roughness to 0, it will be more or less like a mirror surface. And you may want that, but I don't. So I will use some metallic and some roughness. You can play with it, the settings. There are a lot of other settings. Specular, I'm not sure what that does. Yep, anyway. You can play with the alpha or the opacity. So by reducing that, your objects will be less opaque, and you may want to use that. For this, I don't think I want that. So let me deselect it. I think that looks pretty nice. You can, of course, do a lot more with Blender with modifiers and shading and so on. But this part here, these settings, will get you pretty far. The next step is to place your camera. So right now the camera is here, barely visible. But you can also select it up here to the right, camera. And let's move it. G to grab. And Z to lock it on the Z axis. G to grab. Shift Z to lock it on the plane. So let's start it right here. And to see what the camera sees, you press 0 on the numpad or this button here, the camera button. One way to place the camera in the way you want it, it is to expand the side panel by having the mouse in the 3D view, pressing N, and then going to View, and this button or this checkbox here, Camera to View, select it. And now when you move in the 3D view, the camera will be fixed to this location. As you see here, there's clipping in the viewer. So with the camera selected, go to the camera properties, and here at lens settings, you have clip start and clip end. And if you have clipping, you increase this value. So in my case, I think 500 will be enough. Yes. And now it's just a question of moving, panning, tilting, zooming to a view that you think is nice for your settings. So maybe something like that, perhaps. To stop or place the camera at this location, you just uncheck this checkbox again, and then you can hide the sidebar by pressing N. To view a render of this view, you go to Render and press Render Image or F12 on the keyboard. And then it will use the render settings you have to render this. And depending on your hardware, this will take more or less time. This is looking pretty okay. I think I need to change the plane color. So select the plane, go to the material settings, select a new material, change the base color to completely white. Let's see if that works. Yeah, that is better. I may want to play with the lighting some. So select the light. The angle here, that's how big the sun disk appears from this location. So if you make it really big, your shadows will be very fuzzy. And if you make it really small, the shadows will be sharper. And I want some fuzziness, but not too much. And I think I want to increase the strength. Maybe like that. Yeah, and let's try a new render. Yeah, that looks okay for now. And as I mentioned, you can play even further with more advanced settings, materials and shaders and textures and so on. But this is one simple way to render out a 3D object that you have created in QGIS. Just save the image, save as. Then we can switch back to QGIS, and instead of using this 3D view in our layout, we can still use QGIS to create the layout. So pop layout. Let's do it like that. And instead of adding a 3D view, okay. Do I need to show that view? Yeah, of course I need to. Let's use that. And copy that, and copy that. As you see here, in this case, it didn't work that good. So instead of using a 3D map, I'll just use an image. And it will be a raster image. There we go. There it is. And I could play with this image some more in Blender, so I get it completely white. But in this case, it doesn't really matter. I can make the background the same color. Instead, the background. Why don't I get a color picker? Here we go, sample, that one. Like that. And now I can do whatever I need to do in the layout, adding arrows, text, so on. And that's basically it. This is how you can start work your normal workflow in QGIS, pre-visualize the 3D and create the actual volumes in 3D in QGIS, and then simply export the 3D object and render it in Blender. And then you just use that rendered image in your layouts in QGIS. And that is all for now, and see you next time.